Good morning and welcome to Rising. We have a great show for you today. I'm Amber Duke, joined by Niall Standage.
Great to see you, Amber. Always a Friday treat to have these debates and conversations with
I know, and for the audience, we're going to be on together for a while.
We are.
So stick around.
United on a Friday.
President Trump initiated the process of dismantling the Department of Education yesterday.
Here he is from the White House.
We're going to be returning education very simply back to the states where it belongs, and this is a very popular thing to do, but much more importantly, it's a common sense thing to do, and it's going to work. People have wanted to do this for many, many years, for many, many decades, and I don't know, no president ever got around to doing it, but I'm getting around to doing it, so thank you very much.
The executive order reads in part, unfortunately, the experiment of controlling American education through federal programs and dollars and the unaccountable bureaucracy those programs and dollars support has plainly failed our children, our teachers, and our families. The department has now been stripped down to very few essential operations.
When it comes to student loans, Pell Grants and funding for special needs students, the Education Department says it will continue to deliver on those programs. Eventually, Trump says that Pell Grants and Title I funding will be redistributed to other agencies. Critics, though, are raising the alarm. The CEO of the Institute for College Access and Success, Samir Gadkari, told The Guardian, shuttering the Department of Education would prove disastrous for students, borrowers, and our nation's future workforce. Without the department, fewer students would be able to go to college, student loan borrowers would default in droves, and fraudulent colleges would prey on students with impunity. Democratic Congressman Maxwell Frost said, the reality is that the Trump administration does not have the constitutional power to eliminate the Department of Education without the approval of Congress. However, what they will do is defund and destabilize the agency to manufacture chaos and push their extremist agenda.
Meanwhile, House Freedom Caucus Chair Andy Harris said, the Department of Education has failed its mission because it is promoting everything except reading, writing, and arithmetic. President Trump is returning education back to the states and giving power to parents and students.
So I suspect we'll be on different sides of this one, Amber. I think that there are a couple of worrisome things about this. One is, it's not clear to me whether this is primarily political theatre or an actual shuttering of the department. Because in some of those remarks we showed from President Trump, he verbally made these promises about some of those programs continuing. The language of the executive order does not say that. It's much more sweeping. It just sort of says that the DOE, Department of Education, will be shut down to the maximum extent possible under the law. It was set up by Congress. Congress is the one that has the power to actually end it. But of course it can be hollowed out. The bigger danger, I think, is if it's not political theatre and the things that the Department of Education does fall through the cracks. I know it has a huge image problem, and I suspect you might make the argument that it's federal overreach or whatever, but there are a number of programs, whether it's support for schools in low-income areas, support for disabled students, the civil rights element of the Department of Education and so forth, that actually do a lot. And some of it, and I'll shut up after this, some of it is geared very much toward, well, it's distributed to the states proportionately. So lots of Republican states get a very significant amount of money from the Department of Education. 2024, Alabama, $2.8 billion, Tennessee, $3.5 billion in education funding to support things like rural schools, schools in low-income areas and those sort of places. Where's that money going to come from?
Yeah, so most of the school funding for public schools does come through state and local taxes. Right. And so presumably the money that typically gets routed through the Department of Education would simply be given back to the states. And in addition...
Well, hold on, because the money that the Department of Education has is from federally raised taxes. So there would be no obligation to say, well, Alabama got $2.8 billion, we'll give Alabama $2.8 billion.
If Congress still appropriates the money, then it would still have to go through. It just wouldn't be routed through the Department of Education. It would presumably be handed directly to the states if they decide to continue to fund education from a federal level.
I'm not sure it's guaranteed to go at the same level. But anyway, go on with whatever your bigger point is.
Yeah, so I mean, I think when Americans look at the education system, they see that despite federal funding for schools increasing significantly over the past 20 to 30 years, we've seen educational outcomes decrease. Now, part of that is certainly due to the pandemic learning loss, where a lot of schools were shuttered for as long as 2.5 years, and students were expected to learn via Zoom. But during that same time frame, what was really interesting is the Washington Post actually did an analysis of parents who were choosing to either put their kids in private schools or to homeschool their children. And they found that this was not a partisan endeavor, that the parents who were making the choice to pull their kids out of public school cut across demographic lines, religious lines, racial lines, across bipartisan lines, because they recognized that their students weren't really getting the education that they deserved. And so what the Republican Party has been advocating for the past 20 years has been a school choice program, which is to say that the tax dollars that you would typically pay in through your state tax burden would be, and the money from that goes to educate your child, would be given in a lump sum or some kind of account that would go to the parent, and then the parent can use that to pay for private school tuition or pay for materials for homeschooling. They could put the extra in a 529 plan to pay for college if their student's not attending the public school. Because if you're taking tax dollars and your kid's not going to public school, then what is that money really being used for? So that's really the broader vision of reducing the size of the Department of Education. You're right, they can't completely eliminate it without an act of Congress, but they basically want to strip it down to its essential functions.
Yes, but I think that there is an adjacent and related argument, of course, about school choice and exactly how that is framed and exactly how money gets apportioned and so forth. And there has for a very long time been a concern, I think, on the liberal or left side that a lot of the push for quote-unquote school choice is about hollowing out public education generally, and about also hollowing out the sway of teachers' unions, which you might think is a good idea, other people think is a bad idea. But the separate point here, I think, is to do with the Department of Education itself, because it seems to me that it is often misrepresented in the sense that it is not, as you well know, the Department of Education that dictates curricula to schools. They set standards, right, and then it is up to the states to figure out how to meet those standards, teaching what they or local school districts want. There is also, as I mentioned, the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Education. And I think that has got caught up in this debate about wokeness, DEI, etc. Now, if you actually go to the source, which is that division of the Department of Education, you find out that in the resolutions of cases that they have brought, those that are about discrimination on the basis of disability outnumber those brought on the basis of race by almost 6 to 1. Now, that is, I'm not belittling discrimination cases brought on the basis of race, obviously, but what is going to happen to those kids who suffer from some level of disability and for whom the danger is there will not be adequate provision made?
Yeah, so the administration has said that they are simply going to take the Office of Civil Rights that's housed within
the DOJ.
Right, under the broader Office of Civil Rights. So those cases would presumably still be adjudicated just under a separate process.
Except that that's not in the executive order, Amber. You see, this is where we get, I think, concerned, because it's a debate about whether what Trump says verbally is, when that differs from what is written down, will he do what he says verbally?
Yeah, it's a broad executive order, that's true. It's vague. I mean, we'll have to see what they do with it in order to determine whether or not they're telling the truth. The Daily Caller got the exclusive on Linda McMahon's first statement to the public after this executive order was signed, and she echoed what Trump said, which is, quote, "Closing the department does not mean cutting off funds from those who depend on them. We will continue to support K-12 students, students with special needs, college student borrowers, and others who rely on essential programs. We're going to follow the law and eliminate the bureaucracy responsibly by working with Congress and state leaders to ensure a lawful and orderly transition." On your point about standards versus curriculum, it is true that they don't create a curriculum in the literal sense of the word, but the way that the federal standards process works is that there are certain tests that students need to pass. There are certain parts of standards that are pretty indistinguishable from curriculum. If for example, if the Department of Education says students need to be able to complete A, B, C things before they move up to the next grade, that's effectively curriculum.
It's not really, Amber. I mean, to say that someone, for example, in the 3rd grade should be able to read at a certain level does not require the state to say they need to read that book, which I think is what the conservative fear typically is.
But the federal government does create tests to determine whether or not the student is meeting that reading level that's set by the Department of Education. So if you're handing a test with certain questions on it to a school, that's curriculum, right? And
we'll agree to disagree. Go ahead.
Okay, agree to disagree. But I think that there's actually been a lot of harm to students done by this teaching to the test method, where I do think that states and localities should have a little bit more say over curriculum. I mean, for example, if the Department of Education has a history test that they provide to schools around the country, what does that mean for teaching local history or state history? Does that hollow out those programs that might be designed to be more unique to different parts of the country, you know, based on where you grow up? Maybe if you're from Kentucky, your school should teach a little bit more about Kentucky history, its role in the Civil War, for example, and being sort of a middle state where the Union and the Confederacy sort of traded off control of certain areas, as opposed to spending a significant amount of time on like westward expansion. I think those are reasonable debates to have, and they're ones that maybe the federal government shouldn't have as much of a say in.
So, you know more about Kentucky history than I do, so I'm certainly not going to try to battle you on that point. But I think that it's interesting, the teach to the test issue, and you know, education is one of those things that I consider myself in some ways slightly small c conservative about. Like, for example, I'm in favour of mandatory school uniforms, which nobody's in favour of anymore.
I love that.
But the other thing is that in terms of teaching to the test, I think that the merits of that idea is it actually does not leave that much wiggle room to get around a certain standard by you know, by frankly things that are often characterized or caricatured as liberal ideas about, you know, participation trophies, that if you have to teach to the test on reading or math or whatever, people have to hit a certain standard, and I think they should have to hit a certain standard.
So I agree with that to an extent, because it sounds nice on its face, but you have to think about the trade-off and the opportunity cost there, because when a teacher is responsible for making sure all of her students hit this federal benchmark, what they're leaving behind is focus on things like critical thinking skills and soft skills that are really important, I think, for students to learn in school. And so what happens is you have students focus on rote memorization rather than, I think, a deeper level of learning and education, which is one of the complaints that I think parents had when they saw kind of what their students were actually doing during the pandemic, which was they're filling out worksheets all day and they're basically doing busy work as opposed to really having a deep understanding of subjects and being able to take their time. And the other issue with this teach to the test type of standard is that you don't get individualization among students based on what their needs are.
Fair enough. I think those are fair points.
Thank you.
And there'll be more coming up soon when we go to the new Attorney General, who is focusing on what she calls domestic terrorism. Stay with us.
Attorney General Pam Bondi is cracking down on suspects allegedly vandalizing Tesla dealerships and vehicles.
So far, the DOJ has charged 3 people who were allegedly involved in these attacks.
Bondi said in a statement Thursday, "The days of committing crimes without consequence have ended. Let this be a warning. If you join this wave of domestic terrorism against Tesla properties, the Department of Justice will put you behind bars." One of the defendants allegedly threw 8 Molotov cocktails at a Tesla dealership in Oregon and was armed with a suppressed AR-15, the DOJ says. Another in Colorado allegedly tried to light Teslas on fire with Molotov cocktails, per the DOJ.
And in South Carolina, a defendant allegedly lit Tesla charging stations on fire, also with Molotov cocktails, and wrote profane anti-Trump messages in the area. Each defendant faces up to 20 years in prison.
Former U.S. Attorney Barbara McQuaid, who was appointed by Obama, commented on the nature of Bondi using the term terrorism, telling the Wall Street Journal, "It is an aggressive use of terminology, likely to send a message of deterrence, but it's not wrong."
The journal also notes that designating crimes as domestic terrorism gives the DOJ more investigative tools to crack down on those acts.
Vice President J.D. Vance gave an interesting theory during an interview as to who might be behind these alleged attacks.
The other thing I always wonder with this stuff is, this is not cheap, right? Terrorism is not cheap. We saw that in the Middle East 25 years ago. You had some very wealthy financiers of al-Qaeda. My guess is that if we do get to the bottom of this, we're going to find out that there are some very crazy, very deranged, but very wealthy left-wing people who are funding this stuff. And I think that is the most important thing that we have to focus on. It's not the foot soldiers, it's the guy at the top writing the checks.
Great interview there with my colleague Vince Colonnese. Trump posted on Truth Social this morning, "I look forward to watching the sick terrorist thugs get 20-year jail sentences for what they are doing to Elon Musk and Tesla. Perhaps they could serve them in the prisons of El Salvador, which have become so recently famous for such lovely conditions."
Journalist Ken Klippenstein wrote on Substack, "Even if what they did can be argued to meet the dictionary definition of terrorism, its legal application would give the government a frankly terrifying amount of power. Trump is now unleashing the deep state, their deep state, to go after associates and others who support or contemplate similar acts. In other words, to criminalize and then stigmatize opposition." Well, where will we start here, Amber? The term terrorism is one that I tend to be reluctant to use across the board, whether the acts are from left-wing people or right-wing people, because oftentimes the way it's used seems to me to betray the ideological leanings of the person who's using it. There are exceptions to that. I mean, 9/11 was obviously terrorism, right? You just set out to kill as many civilians as you possibly can. Is somebody vandalizing a Tesla charging station domestic terrorism? That seems very overwrought to me. I think it's a criminal offence of vandalism, and that's something that the courts should look into. Rhetoric about terrorism, I tend to be a bit wary of.
I think what pushes this into the terrorism category is the fact that this is clearly becoming an organized way of trying to intimidate Elon Musk and Tesla owners. There was a website that was online for a few days earlier this week that put out the private addresses of Tesla owners with a Molotov cocktail icon if you clicked on it, so that people could go about firebombing or attacking private citizens who just happen to own Teslas. We've seen a lot of people around DC, I'm sure you've seen the same, putting bumper stickers on their Tesla that says, "I bought this before I knew Elon was crazy."
Right.
Saying, "Hey guys, please don't target
Sure.
me." And so to me, the terrorism question is, what is the motivation behind this? And it seems pretty obvious to me that this is a form of political intimidation.
So I think that one of the reasons I'm wary of the label is you can apply it to any act of vandalism or violence against property even that has a political motivation. It is obviously the case here that it does have a political motivation. But do we term every single thing in that respect terrorism? One of the people we mentioned is accused of writing profane anti-Trump slogans on property or of some description. That's, as I say, vandalism. If he's writing anti-Trump things, that has a political motive. But do we really think of that as terrorism in the same way as J.D. Vance citing the term, citing references to al-Qaeda? I mean, it seems if you're going to broaden the category to that extent, you seem to be broadening it to a point of near meaninglessness to me.
I think it's fair to say it's not the same as al-Qaeda because they haven't killed 2,000 people, but I don't think that makes it not acceptable for the category. And the broadness of the category could be concerning, but in this case, I think this one is just so obvious to me that it is domestic terrorism. And I know that...
Really, you genuinely think that it is actual domestic terrorism, just like spray paint anti-Trump slogans?
It's a firebomb Tesla chargers and Teslas and dealerships.
Yeah, but what,
target private owners and the director of the FBI. Yeah, absolutely.
Right, but those are acts of violence or acts of threats towards individuals. Do you consider like the vandalization of property to be domestic terrorism?
But it's not about individuals, it's Tesla as a symbol of opposition to Elon Musk and the political policies that he is implementing in government. It's very obviously intended to me. I mean, you have these people celebrating the drop of the Tesla stock prices. You have them putting the FBI director, people who have been critical of government bureaucracy, like Mike Benz, on this website to target them. And the graffiti is obviously not as disturbing as the firebombing, but to sort of minimize it as just like vandalism against cars, I think misses the broader point of what the intention is. And also, it is dangerous, incredibly dangerous, to set things on fire. I mean, not
defending arson.
Right. These electric vehicles have batteries that blow up. I mean, the cars literally explode when they get set on fire. We don't know if there are employees in these dealerships when these people are tossing these Molotov cocktails. Are they checking to make sure that the cars are unoccupied? If they set some private individual's car on fire, what happens to their house that's sitting right next to it? I just think it's much more serious than not you specifically, but some of the media has been describing it. I mean, we've had CNN and MSNBC anchors describe it as forms of protest. We've had individuals in the media say that this is a very spirited form of protest, and to me it harkens back to the summer of 2020 when they were describing burning down cities as fiery but mostly peaceful.
You see, I have said I'm not here to defend arson, but I think it's important, like, for example, forms of protest. There have been protests outside Tesla showrooms, which is a completely legitimate form of protest. And when it gets into the category of J.D. Vance implying or accusing very wealthy people of being behind this and saying things like terrorism is not cheap. Well, if we're defining getting a spray can and writing profane anti-Trump things on a wall somewhere, it is actually quite cheap. And so I wonder whether his kind of definition is geared to suggest, oh, well, people can't really be organically outraged about what Elon Musk is doing. There must be shadowy forces behind it. Whereas, in fact, when you look at what Elon Musk is doing, or you look at some of the rhetoric, even things like feeding USAID into the wood chipper, we could have a whole separate debate about whether it's right or wrong to do that. But there are plainly a lot of people very outraged by what they consider his buying of influence and then his actions within the government in that way.
Yeah, I think it's reasonable to have questions about what J.D. Vance has said and other members of the administration have said about potential organization, formal organization behind this or funding of this. And we've asked the White House about this on two separate occasions, I believe. We asked them in the White House press briefing earlier this week. Our White House correspondent, Reagan Reese, said, do you believe that this is being organized by an outside group, and do you think an outside group is funding it? And are you investigating it that way? And Caroline Leavitt kind of punted on that question. So, I mean, that's something that we definitely want to know from the administration and want to know what the evidence is for that, if that is indeed what they think is happening.
Absolutely. Yeah. We'd like to see the evidence. Up next, who would have thought the face of the Democratic resistance would be an 83-year-old? You can probably guess who, but stick with us anyway.
Senator Bernie Sanders has a message for flailing Democrats. Don't be Democrats.
Sanders has launched a tour of rallies titled Fighting Oligarchy. That word that I loved. I wish I could impersonate his accent when I say it. Oligarchy. Anyway, in an interview with the New York Times, he said one of the aspects of this tour is to try to rally people to get engaged in the political process and run as independents outside of the Democratic Party. There's a lot of great leadership all over this country at the grassroots level. We've got to bring that forward. And if we do that, we can defeat Trumpism and we can transform the political situation in America. Here is Bernie Sanders on CNN recently.
The Democratic Party has virtually no grassroots support. So what we are trying to do is, in one way or another, maybe create a party within the party.
The unlikely 83-year-old leader of the so-called Democratic resistance has taken his message to the streets with his Oligarchy tour. This week, a special guest is joining.
Next week, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and I will be going to Colorado, Nevada, Arizona to hold town meetings with working people. Why are we doing that? We're doing that because I believe that all over this country, people are profoundly disgusted with what is going on here in Washington, D.C. They see our great nation moving toward an oligarchy where Elon Musk and other billionaires are running the government. We're going to win this thing not here in Washington, D.C. We're going to win it when millions of people, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, stand up and say, you know what, this is not the kind of government we want.
Sanders has been drawing impressive crowds in the Midwest in recent weeks. 2,600 people attended a rally in Altoona, Wisconsin, which has a total population of 10,000.
Democrats, especially Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, have been taking heat from all sides due to their weaknesses when it comes to fighting Trump. Luckily for Ocasio-Cortez and Sanders, the voters seem to be on their side over someone like Schumer. A CNN survey released over the weekend showed that voters believed Ocasio-Cortez best reflected the party's core values. Former Vice President Kamala Harris came in at second, Sanders in third, and House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries in fourth.
In response to Sanders' tour, slow-boring columnist Matthew Iglesias tweeted this weekend, "Is Bernie running in 2028? Is he going to endorse someone?" To which Ocasio-Cortez fired back, "Believe it or not, some people's everyday actions aren't motivated by some long-term career ambition, but out of a genuine love for people and a desire to do right by them." Sanders expressed amazement earlier this month at how his crowd in Michigan was filled to overflowing. He says more than 9,000 people showed up. Sanders also took to X earlier this week and wrote, "The Democratic Party needs a major transformation. It can no longer be a top-down, billionaire-funded, consultant-driven party. It must be a multi-generational, multiracial, working-class party. In a time of growing oligarchy and authoritarianism, that's the only path to victory."
This call was not met without criticism, however. Scientist Brett Weinstein replied, "No, Bernie Sanders, the Democratic Party's betrayal of the Republic is far too severe for reform. Any revision would be disingenuous. The party must be put down like a rabid animal. The fault is as much yours as anyone's. I say that as a Democrat and 2016 Sanders supporter."
I don't know who that guy is. I assume he's criticizing from the left. I'm not sure we really love support the suggestion that political parties should be put down like a rabid animal. I think we can do without that. My view of this is that one of the reasons for Sanders' appeal is authenticity, and a second reason is one thing he oddly shares with Trump, which is a clarity of message. Now, I think they are very different messages, but they're both in many ways a response to, I would say, public discontent or anger or disenchantment with the political system. And so Trump says, essentially, that's the fault of liberals and the quote-unquote deep state and immigrants and blah, blah, blah. And Sanders says, well, no, actually, it's the fault of the billionaire class who have captured the political system and are running it for their own benefit, and working people have to fight back against that. It would be no surprise which of those interpretations I personally favour, but I think that the point is Sanders' explanation of it is a lot clearer than a lot of other people in the Democratic Party who sort of flim-flam around it.
One of the other things that I think is appealing about Bernie that doesn't transfer to figures like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is that he has the populist economics portion without the cultural wokeness. He hasn't really waded into identity politics issues. He's not really interested in those types of cultural fights. And so I think people really resonate with that. When you get into AOC, she has the same economic bent, but then when she starts talking about cultural issues, I think that's where she loses people. So if Democrats are saying that she is the person who best represents the values of the party, that's probably going to be concerning for a lot of Democrats as they look at that as one of the key reasons that they lost in the previous election. And a lot of members of the party are trying to move to center on cultural issues, most notably Gavin Newsom, who on the first episode of his podcast announced several things that he had vocally supported in the past, like the use of the term Latinx or the participation of transgender women or biological men in women's sports, the idea that government should be paying for transition surgeries for people in prison. Again, all things he supported last year, but is now running away from on his podcast because he feels like the party has to make a cultural move to the center.
Yeah, I think AOC actually did remove the pronouns from her X profile shortly after the last election, which was interpreted, I think, as being some small move toward quieting those concerns. I also think she's been interesting in the sense that she has specifically asked Trump supporters or people who voted for her in the House race and Trump in the presidential race why they did that. Yeah,
that was interesting.
So that was interesting. The other thing, to your point about Bernie Sanders, I do agree that he does not emphasize the social or cultural issues so much. And I think that's a really interesting debate on the left, because Sanders is frankly old enough to have been brought up in a left where the idea was, in say the labor movement, it doesn't really matter whether we are of different races or different genders or go to different churches, we find common economic cause in campaigning for better wages or whatever. That has been overtaken somewhat, well, more than somewhat in recent years by a greater focus on identity, and as identity as being the determining factor. And I think even from a left perspective, there was a bigger downside to that than a lot of people realize.
Yeah, it served as a distraction from the real class issues and class disparities that I think both the populist left and the populist right have been talking about in recent years. And Bernie Sanders even used to sound a lot like Trump on immigration. If you go back and listen to his videos from like 2010, he was talking about cheap immigrant labor suppressing the wages of Americans, and then kind of abandoned that message when it became relatively unpopular within the Democratic Party. But I think this Democratic infighting in regards to Chuck Schumer and what is the best way to fight against Trump is really fascinating, because you've had a lot of Democratic congresspeople go out and do town halls because they've criticized the Republicans for not doing them enough and making this claim that they're going to be the ones answering to constituents. And a lot of them expected that they were going to get a very welcome reception, and that hasn't been the case because they've been flooded with members of the Democratic base who are angry with them for not shutting down the government or otherwise siding with Chuck Schumer. Ruben Gallego, Mark Kelly, even former Democratic Rep. Malinowski. In Maryland, you had Glenn Ivey all doing town halls, and people showed up and were actually very angry with them. And so it almost actually served the opposite of what they were hoping for, which was to cut this stark contrast between communication with voters between Democrats and Republicans. And instead, they had members of their base come in and say, actually, you're not doing enough for us.
Right, you need to fight harder, which I think is a big message from a large part of the Democratic base. Coming up, another bombshell on how the Biden team handled COVID-19. Stick with us for that.
Trust the science. That's what former President Joe Biden told the American people. But did he? A new bombshell report reveals he ignored 3 of the 4 medical experts he sought counsel from in 2021 when COVID policy was crafted. While his handpicked team concluded that a prior COVID-19 infection should qualify as one of the 2 doses of the mRNA vaccine, Biden's administration disagreed.
The administration's federal mandate impacted millions of people, many of whom lost their jobs for not adhering to that policy. Here to elaborate on her reporting is Emily Kopp, investigative reporter with the Daily Caller News Foundation. Welcome, Emily.
Good morning.
So I just want to start off with what we alluded to in the introduction there, because my own feeling is anytime COVID comes up, it's very easy for things to get sort of overly generalized. So correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understand your story, it's about this board or panel of 4 scientists who were brought together by the Biden administration in late 2021. At issue was a mandate for the federal workforce, but the disagreement really was whether prior infection should count as equivalent to one of the 2 mRNA shots, correct?
Yeah, so let's dig into the specifics. So I wrote this story to highlight a chapter in pandemic history that I don't think millions of people are aware of. It involves this 30-minute Zoom meeting that shaped the livelihoods of millions of Americans. the Biden administration was implementing these OSHA emergency temporary standards, vaccine mandates, in other words, that applied to large private employers, federal agencies and contractors, health providers accepting Medicare and Medicaid funding. And these vaccine mandates were mimicked by many large county and municipal governments as well. And so altogether, these policies affected more than 100 million Americans. So in October 2021, top Biden health officials, including former CDC Director Rochelle Walensky and Chief Scientific Advisor Anthony Fauci, privately met with 4 immunology and vaccinology experts. These experts are familiar to many of us because they were in the press a lot during the height of the pandemic. Paul Offit, Michael Osterholm, Peter Hotez, and Akiko Iwasaki. The administration posed a question to these experts: should prior immunity be counted when implementing vaccine mandates? Should people who have recovered from a prior infection be exempted from the requirement to get vaccinated or lose their jobs? News of this meeting has trickled out in bits and pieces over the years, thanks largely to the Epoch Times, which obtained information about it via FOIA. What hasn't been previously reported is that the majority of these scientific experts handpicked indeed prior immunity should be credited under the vaccine mandates. There was a 3-1 split in favor of prior infection counting in some capacity. And what you touched upon is that 2 of the experts said that while hybrid immunity is best, an infection should be treated as equivalent to 1 dose of the 2-dose mRNA regimen. So that's absolutely correct. The Biden administration apparently overruled this advice and required that even individuals with a prior infection receive both doses. One of the experts present at the October meeting told me that he thought it was simply because it was simpler logistically that way. But when asked about this policy in the media and when pressed by congressional Republicans at the time, that's not what Walensky and Fauci said. They didn't talk about logistical issues. They talked about hybrid immunity being preferred while sidestepping the question of whether prior immunity alone or prior immunity in a single shot might be sufficient for many Americans.
But sorry, just because I do think these
instance,
specifics are important, Emily. Just sorry to cut
course.
across you, but of the 4 people, as I read your piece, none of them were arguing that prior immunity would be equivalent to the benefits of receiving both shots of the vaccine. It was whether, to use your word, it would be credited as 1 shot of the 2 required, no?
So Paul Offit, who is among the best recognized vaccinologists in the world, has argued and continues to argue that prior infection gives you durable long-term immunity against severe disease, and that prior immunity would be sufficient. And in fact, I talked to him back in 2020 when the clinical trials were going on. And I remember him saying that very good vaccines will give you equivalent protection as a prior infection. Very good vaccines will give you equivalent protection as a natural immunity. But that was the goal, right? And since that time, we've seen a variety of studies and some conflicting conclusions whether prior immunity is superior or the 2-dose vaccine regimen is superior. Hybrid immunity is generally recognized to be the best, but I think the science clearly was not as black and white as many people who were affected by the vaccine mandates were led to believe.
One of the things that concerned me in your report as well is you mentioned that this meeting only lasted for 30 minutes. This was a sweeping federal policy that, as you mentioned, impacted millions of people within the federal bureaucracy and even more outside of it. It's kind of stunning to me that it only took them 30 minutes of advice from these scientific officials to then ignore everything they said and go forward with a 2-shot mandate anyway.
Yeah, it is sort of remarkable because I think typically with major decisions regarding medical countermeasures that are being taken by millions of people, you would convene an FDA advisory group, this advisory group called the VRBPAC, which did provide input on a lot of the decisions around the COVID vaccines. They didn't do that in this case. They talked to 4 experts privately. We only know about this meeting because Offit talked about it on a podcast and because there was a FOIA request by the Epoch Times that unveiled some details, including the detail that it was only scheduled for 30 minutes. So that's a major contrast to what we typically expect with big decisions like this, where outside experts would have a public meeting and where the public would, have the opportunity to give their input as well. And I think it was important to revisit this chapter in pandemic history that a lot of people aren't aware of, because of course there's been a lot of discussion of late about the power of the executive branch via DOGE to lay off federal workers. And there's been a lot of media attention, on DOGE's efforts to reduce the size of government and, in some cases, shutter entire federal agencies. And I think reasonable people can debate about whether those layoffs are capricious or extra legal. But both Democrats and Republicans agree that the mission of DOGE to reduce fraud, waste, and abuse in government is a worthy one. And I think it's interesting to look back at this pretty recent history and remember this episode during which the executive branch was effectively executing the layoffs, not just of federal bureaucrats, but of a lot of frontline health professionals and military service members. And unlike with DOGE, it's not clear that the mission was entirely a worthy one. In many cases, people were fired who already had immunity from severe disease, if you believe Paul Offit.
But Emily, I think this is why the one-shot issue becomes more important, because if you're extrapolating from this the argument about laying people off because they refused to get vaccinated and had some principled objection or some concern about that. The difference of opinion that you are drawing attention to would only differentiate between people who got one shot and that was sufficient as opposed to people who got two shots. If you had an objection to getting vaccinated at all, the distinction is moot, surely, because they're still saying get one shot.
I think it's totally fair to point out that distinction. One thing that Anthony Fauci said that I totally agree with is that we need to conduct sociological studies to better understand vaccine hesitancy and how these mandates might have affected vaccine hesitancy. Would a more nuanced approach where, okay, you only have to get one shot of the 2-dose mRNA regimen, would that have instigated as much backlash as the more simplistic message favored by Walensky and Fauci did? I think it's an open question and I think it should be studied. I think one major reason that I wanted to write this story is that people who are familiar with the history of Paul Offit and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. know that these men are arch rivals. At one point, Kennedy said that Offit belonged in jail. But I think it's interesting that even people at bitter loggerheads about vaccine policy and public policy both agree that there were opaque decisions made during the pandemic that were not entirely science-driven, that were driven by having a simplistic public health message that have led to our current culture of there being a lot of mistrust. And I think the scientific community, given that people with entirely different worldviews both agree on that point, needs to have a vigorous debate about how the public health establishment makes up for lost ground.
Yeah, I think the broader point that you're getting at here, Emily, is the idea that if people were properly communicated that natural immunity does have some significance when it comes to prevention from serious infection, perhaps they wouldn't have had as much widespread vaccine hesitancy because they would have felt like they weren't being taken for a ride by public health officials. And I have to say, taking Niall's point from the opposite side of the political spectrum, I was a bit I felt like some of the scientists in this meeting, it seemed like, didn't go far enough into accepting the significance of prior infection in terms of natural immunity, which has been well established in the time since this meeting happened. And I wanted to bring up another article that you wrote recently about this new Yale study about what's called post-vaccine syndrome, where people have developed chronic conditions like brain fog, muscle aches, and excessive fatigue. There were legitimate reasons for people to be hesitant or skeptical about the COVID-19 vaccines that I feel like weren't properly appreciated by public health officials at the time, which drove a lot of these federal employees to feel like they had to resign or be forcibly fired rather than go ahead with this 2-shot regimen.
Yeah, and the lead author of that paper is actually one of the scientists who was present at this October Zoom meeting, October 2021 Zoom meeting, Akiko Iwasaki. And she writes that for some people, we don't know how many people, but they struggle to clear the spike protein after a vaccine, and it causes long-term inflammation in a way that mimics long COVID. So, without mandates, would more people have long COVID? With mandates, do more people have this post-vaccine syndrome? I think scientists should have those discussions, and I think there should be more studies. One of the things that Iwasaki's co-authors mentioned is that they could only do a very small scale study because it's very difficult to get NIH funding to broach these really taboo questions. So I think we have a lot more to learn about what went wrong with COVID, but I think we shouldn't be afraid to ask the questions.
Sure. Thanks. Emily Kopp, Daily Caller News Foundation. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You bet. All right, up next, a former Trump official will discuss the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. Stick around.
President Trump's promise to deport people by any available means took an ominous turn last weekend. That's when the administration invoked the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. This act allows the government to deport non-citizens without due process.
Hundreds of migrants and alleged members of the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua were rounded up Saturday, shackled and thrown on planes bound for El Salvador.
Critics have balked at Trump's application of the law, saying it should be used only in times of declared war. It was intended as a law to apprehend and remove foreign nationals from nations that were indeed at war with the United States.
The United States has previously invoked the Alien Enemies Act 3 times, once during the 1812 War, World War I, and then in World War II when Japanese citizens were placed in internment camps.
Meanwhile, Judge James Boasberg tried to block the flights, but the administration says his order came too late. At least 2 of the 3 planes carrying deportees were already in the air.
Boasberg's order sparked a debate over the legality of Trump's action and judicial overreach. Joining us now to get to the bottom of whether Trump has legal standing to invoke the Alien Enemies Act is Theodore Wold, a senior fellow at Claremont Institute and former deputy assistant to President Trump. Theo, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with Trump's invocation of the order. He has said that rather than invoking it because we are in a time of war, he's used the clause regarding an invasion, referring to the overtaking of the southern border by illegal aliens as an invasion, and as well as Venezuela's alleged direction of Tren de Aragua to enter the United States. So let's start from there in terms of the legal authority Trump has to actually invoke this law and use it to deport alleged members of the gang.
Yeah, so first off, this is a long-standing statute, which, contrary to a lot of the legal leftist commentary on this, it makes it more legitimate, not less. It's been on the books now for close to 2 centuries. Number 2, this power, Congress gives this power exclusively to the president in these instances. The phrase that's important here are predatory incursions into U.S. territory. So again, unlike most of the leftist legal commentary that has sort of surrounded the invocation of this act, it does not require a declaration of war. That's not a requirement under the terms of the statute itself. But as you noted, it's really important to sort of see the choreography of what the White House has done here. First, they declared the invasion on the southern border. And then second, inconsistent with the terms of the text of the statute itself, the president then invoked the act, gave the declaration, and that's all that's required under the statute itself. The president has to identify the predatory incursion or the threat, the governmental threat to the safety and security of the American people. And then secondly, he has to notify Congress that he's issuing the authority under the act itself. All of that has been satisfied. And unfortunately, for a number of legal commentators who want to sort of graft onto the statute all kinds of other requirements, none of that is actually in the text of the statute itself.
So is your position that the government of Venezuela is invading the United States?
So look, this is an interesting set of facts, right? Number one, you have essentially a failed state in Venezuela itself. And 2, the Tren de Agua, look, when you go back through the history of the gang in Venezuela, was able to take over whole sections or regions of Venezuela, of Venezuelan territory, including Venezuelan governmental facilities, a maximum security prison in the north of Venezuela to start back in 2013. So the one thing I'll offer to your viewers, now think about it this way: when this act was originally enacted by Congress back in the 18th century, it was a sort of standard practice of international law that pirates operating on the high seas could be captured and then summarily executed, because pirates were an extra-legal, extrajudicial threat to the ordering of commerce and also to good governance and the protection of innocent maritime vessels, innocent citizens traveling abroad. There's no notion really of criminal international transnational gangs at that time. But if you had to draw an analogy, gangs are essentially, they operate very similarly to pirates. They're an extrajudicial, extra-legal, extra sort of sovereign threat, both in Venezuela and in the United States. So is it a direct sort of threat to Venezuela? Is it about the Venezuelan government? I think there's an analogy here to draw that Tren de Agua essentially operates as a sovereign state, similar to pirates did in the 18th century.
So, Theo, the reason that I'm asking this is your earlier explanation to Amber, and I love a good debate about the text of a particular statute, because you said, well, look, the left is saying it's all about a declaration of war, when in fact it's about a predatory invasion. But in both those cases in the text of the statute, it is when there is a declared war between the United States and any foreign nation or government, or if there's a predatory incursion, which is the example you cited, against the territory of the United States by any foreign nation or government. Now, to say Tren de Aragua are kind of like pirates, and then that qualifies them to be effectively a foreign nation or government, that seems a stretch to me, whether one is of the left or otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's an operative analogy, but the real point here on whether or not they constitute a foreign nation or a foreign government, we still don't know, not with any certainty, and not sort of in just general civil discourse. This may be available to people on the high side in sort of classified instances. We don't know if Tren de Agua's presence in the United States has been sponsored or has been encouraged by the Maduro regime in Venezuela. So I don't think it's as neat as you'd like to have it, Niall, which is that there's some kind of neat and sort of hermetically sealed distinction between the government of Venezuela and Tren de Agua, or whether or not Tren de Agua has the capacity, sort of analogously, in terms of its capabilities, in terms of its ability to coerce and to conduct violence against innocent citizens, and its ability to move economically across borders, whether or not it's analogously similar to a government, a sovereign government, as we would understand it traditionally in the law.
Well, let me ask the question from a different direction then. If the position is that a quasi-government representing Venezuela in some slightly abstract or nebulous sense is invading the United States, doesn't that then behoove the United States to do more? I mean, if we're saying Venezuela is invading, we should presumably attack Venezuela or something, no?
I think the designations have operated really neatly here, which is the president declared an invasion of the southern border. The president then designated Tren de Agua and similarly situated international cartels, transnational organizations as terroristic threats, and then third, invoked the act here, the Alien and Enemy Act, and then has moved to use those authorities expeditiously to remove those threats from the United States. All of that is entirely consistent, both with this specific statute and also the requirements that law imposes on the president to declare these threats as direct threats on American soil. And I don't think anyone is under the misapprehension that Tren de Agua is president in the United States and has conducted violence against American citizens.
One of the other complaints about Trump's invocation of this statute is the supposed lack of due process that the individuals received. There's been allegations from family members, and there's been articles in the media of people claiming that they're not actually a member of the gang. Now, I don't put a ton of stock in that because, surprise, surprise, criminals lie and gang members lie. But the criticism then goes, okay, they get on a plane and they go to El Salvador, where they then have to go through the appeals process in immigration courts from foreign soil. What is your position on the law's revocation of due process and whether or not people should be concerned about that?
So two things here are really important. Number one, the law doesn't require any due process. That's because the president is given this extraordinary and special power to move expeditiously to remove known national security threats to the American people from our soil. That's how the law was written, and that's how the law has been understood in those various applications that you gave earlier, including most recently in World War II. Secondly, look, this is an unfortunate fact for a lot of folks who want to extend the full panoply of criminal appellate rights to individuals who are present here in the United States illegally, but it's simply just the case that if you're here illegally, you're running the risk that you could be apprehended and removed under the authorities granted to the president under this law, and as such, then look like you're going to be you're going to be in a difficult position to avail yourself of the appellate proceedings in the United States. That's the risk that an illegal alien makes when they enter the country without legal sanction. The second thing I'll note is, look, a lot has been made about these tattoos. I know a lot of friends of mine will ask what happened to me if I've lost my mind. But look, consular officers at the State Department should be given some discretion, some confidence in their ability to perform their job. These individuals go through a process when they're seeking asylum, and often that requires medical examination under the law. In the course of a medical examination, consular affairs officers note, they take designations of tattoos, body markings, piercings. So now in the 11th hour for liberal asylum lawyers to say, hey, this tattoo here is representative of my client's affection for Real Madrid. It's not a Tren de Agua tattoo. Here's the news: like, consular affairs officers detail these things. It's not unknown to the United States government what these tattoos are and what their significance is. So look, this is just kind of a story about nothing.
All right, Theo, thank you for joining us. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
All right, up next, a Fox journalist sticks up for one of their own. We'll fill you in next on Rising.
Conservative media is taking sides, and this time it's not with Donald Trump. Fox News journalists came to the defense of their White House reporter after the president ripped into Jackie Heinrich. It all began at Wednesday's press briefing when Heinrich asked a question that seemed to question the legality of Trump's deportation of migrants. That drew sour words from White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt.
Andy McCarthy said in an interview with Hugh Hewitt, he certainly agrees with what the president is trying to do with the Alien Enemies Act, but he's not sure that the law is completely on his side.
We absolutely disagree with the legal opinion of the individual that you mentioned. It is within the president's authority to deport these terrorists. And anybody trying to defend these terrorists who have now been sent off of American soil should talk to the families of the individuals who these heinous monsters have killed.
Trump wasted no time. Writing on Truth Social soon after, I watched Jackie Heinrich from Fox over the weekend and I thought she was absolutely terrible. She should be working for CNN, not Fox. Not surprisingly, I later found out that she's a fan of the White House Correspondents Association.
Fox News chief political analyst Brit Hume came to his colleague's defense, posting on X, "I watched her too. She plays it straight, covering both sides of a story, and has certainly played fair with you. You may have a case against some White House reporters, but not Jackie Heinrich." And Fox contributor Guy Benson stood up for Andrew McCarthy, writing, "So Andrew McCarthy is more than capable of defending himself in his legal analysis. I'll just note that Andy spent much of his career putting terrorists in prison and has been frequently/positively cited by Trump himself. He's far from a hysterical terrorist defending leftist."
So this is obviously interesting. Some of the timeline of this is a little confused because that press briefing obviously was not at the weekend, and then Trump's Truth Social was referring to watching Jackie over the weekend. So who knows if he's referring to that exact exchange or not. What I did find interesting, and to the credit of Brit Hume in particular, was standing up for his colleague. I don't like the president's propensity to target individual journalists or to criticize individual journalists in that way. And I thought that it was, as I say, a credit to Brit Hume and to anyone else who stands up on Jackie's behalf or behalf of anyone else asking legitimate questions. Briefly on the point about her being, I think the president termed Jackie Heinrich a fan of the White House Correspondents Association. She's on the board of the White House Correspondents Association, so I would kind of hope she was a fan. I think his grievance there is, in that role, she defended the Associated Press over this kerfuffle about Gulf of Mexico versus Gulf of America and access to the pool. And her argument, which I agree with, is that even very Trump-supporting people cheering that on are in effect giving that power to any president to exclude any member of the pool who they don't like.
Yeah, so I found this to be interesting to an extent.
Don't get too carried away there, Amber.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's like, okay, she asked a, sort of difficult question. Trump criticized her, which he does with all journalists. And the only, like, peg here is that it's because it's Fox News. I mean, it's not like Fox has been salivating over Trump. I mean,
Well, I've been doing a fair amount of salivating now, to be fair. There have been some legitimate things, but I mean, Sean Hannity and Laura Ingraham are constantly salivating over Trump.
Right, but they're opinion anchors.
But they're on Fox, though.
Right, but we're talking about the journalism side and the reporters. And I think if you go back to 2020, it was pretty widely reported that the Murdochs did not want Trump to come back into the fold after the January 6th Capitol riot, and they preferred DeSantis in the primary in 2024. So this is not a network that is, I would not describe them as particularly Trumpy outside of their opinion host. And keep in mind, they also fired Tucker Carlson a couple of years back. So to me, this is not like a spat with Breitbart, which I think would be more interesting.
I have to push back, Amber. Maybe we just have different opinions or different perspectives. But the idea that Fox News is not particularly Trumpy, I really can't let that go uncontested. I think that the vast majority of Fox's coverage of the president is extremely sympathetic to Trump, irrespective of what the policy issue is. Now, you can argue, and it's certainly valid to bring up the point of 2020, and Murdoch hoped that Trump could be kind of buried at that point. And then we saw in the Dominion case the extent to which Fox essentially sacrificed a commitment to the truth in favor of catering to an audience that was extremely Trump supportive. So I just don't really take the view that it is unfair in some way to describe Fox News as Trumpy. Now, having said all of that, that is why I think there is merit to recognizing people like Jackie Heinrich for asking what was a fairly pointed question. I've seen Peter Doocy do the same thing, and Brit Hume coming to the defense. And finally, and this is, if anything, a sort of a compliment to Fox, it's interesting to me that someone like Brit Hume will come to his colleague's defense in that way, while we see organizations in this city that are traditionally much more democratic leaning, including this big law firm, Paul Weiss, who have made this kind of bowing of the knee to Trump, agreeing to do $40 million of pro bono work if he will just take his boot off their necks. So anyway, fair play to Brit Hume.
Yeah, so I would point to anchors like Martha McCallum, Brett Baer, Neil Cavuto, Harris Faulkner, who have certainly criticized Trump on a regular basis and questioned the legality of a lot of the executive orders. And so I think we're doing a conflation of, again, the opinion side and the reporters. The reporters come on during the day, the opinion side primetime hosts are on at night. And those are not the same thing. And I would also point out that after 2020, a lot of Trump supporters fled Fox News because they were unhappy with the call on Arizona, and they were unhappy with their pushback against Trump's claims of widespread election fraud. Newsmax's numbers increased significantly in the aftermath of that exodus. So I don't think it's as clear-cut as you're trying to make it out to be.
I mean, Newsmax's numbers in the aftermath of the 2020 election were boosted, it seems to me, because Newsmax fostered false claims of election fraud. And Fox then, to some extent, followed them down that path and ended up in the Dominion debacle. So I think that it is pretty clear-cut that they're very supportive of Trump as a whole. But
you just provided the opposite, which is that Newsmax was going along with what you say are false claims. I mean, we could debate that on a separate show, but wouldn't it stand to reason then that if Fox was not providing enough support to Trump's claims of election fraud, that would put them on the opposite side of that paradigm? No, because they sacrificed that position, is my point. My point is not that they, to their credit, did not entertain for a short period of time false claims. My point is that they were so concerned about the commercial consequences of being skeptical that they abandoned that skepticism and got into a situation where they ended up having to pay Dominion a vast sum of money to settle a defamation case. I think that's an oversimplification of what happened, because it was specifically three particular individuals, right? It was Tucker Carlson, who actually It was bizarre that he was even named in that lawsuit, because when he had Sidney Powell on his program, which is the interview that they took issue with, he pushed back on her incredibly aggressively and was not at all willing to blindly substantiate her claims. The other person who was named was Maria Bartiromo, who talked about election fraud, but never on air, as far as I could tell, gave weight to the idea that Dominion voting systems had been hacked or any of the claims that they made in the lawsuit. And the third individual was Laura Ingraham, who maybe flirted with the line a little bit more than the other two. But again, they never even went to trial. They settled out of court, right? So I think taking like those three claims, one of which was completely bogus, with Tucker actually doing the opposite of what Dominion accused him of doing, as indicative of a network-wide shift, is again overly simplistic.
I mean, I think we just disagree on that point, because you say, oh, well, they settled out of court. They settled for, what was it, was it $800 million? I mean, it was some colossal sum of money. Now, the idea that you do that as a big corporation because you had an absolutely watertight case and you just decided that it would be easier not to go to court, so let's pay them this huge money. I mean, I just don't accept that.
No, they did it because the initial discovery rounds were embarrassing for them.
And why were they embarrassing for them?
Because they showed some network anchors speaking negatively about executives and other things of that nature.
Yeah, but they also showed people broadcasting claims that they knew were false.
No, I don't agree with that characterization of what was in those texts.
We'll agree to disagree yet again. Just as well we have free speech, but next on Rising, is free speech on campus a thing of the past? Once upon a time, at the beginning of this century, Conservatives were the ones to push the boundaries of free speech on college campuses. For example, remember when protests erupted at UC Berkeley to shut down a talk by Milo Yiannopoulos.
The right called foul and said this was a breach of the First Amendment.
Fast forward 8 years, many of those same Conservatives are behind a growing crackdown on political expression at universities.
Just look at what is happening at Columbia. The federal government has withdrawn $400 million, saying the university did not do enough to quell anti-Semitic speech last year at pro-Palestine protests. There are plenty of reports from last year of Jewish students saying that they were fearful.
Still, the GOP has also ordered the removal of LGBTQ symbols from public spaces, as well as art deemed inappropriate. So what happened to the GOP, Amber, that wanted free speech on campus?
Yeah, so I have been pretty consistent on this, which is that I think that making claims about anti-Semitism as being conflated with pro-Palestine protests is not something that I want to see this administration do. And I think they've been overly capitulating to an extent to what some might refer to as the Israel lobby. But the distinction comes in when we start talking about actions as opposed to speech. When you're talking about encampments on Columbia University, overtaking administrative buildings, creating spaces where people who are supportive of Israel or who are Jewish are not allowed to enter, that's completely unacceptable. And so for me, the comparison of what's happening at Columbia or what happened at Columbia with those encampments is incredibly consistent with the complaints about what happened to right-wing speakers on college campuses in the 2012 to 2016 era, which is that they actually created an anti-free speech area because you weren't allowed to have people that opposed them going on public property. The idea of creating an encampment where pro-Israel students are not allowed to enter is remarkably similar to the idea of shouting down conservative speakers on campus. Those are actions, not speech.
Yeah, look, the thing on the free speech question is there is a distinction to be drawn, as you just did, between speech and action, right? And so the whole point is that you can't commit crimes against property or people and say, well, you're expressing an opinion. Right. A crime like that is a crime. Now, where I have the bigger problem, and maybe we don't necessarily disagree with this to an enormous extent, is the most famous case right now, I think, is the Mahmoud Khalil case. Now, he has not been charged with any crime and is facing deportation and has had his liberty taken away, at the least, pertaining to that. Now, I think that we probably have very differing views of the merits of the case he wishes to make, but it seems to me that there are reasons for even someone from a libertarian right perspective to have very great concerns about giving the government that kind of power to remove someone's liberty for their opinions.
Well, it's not giving them the power. They have the power to invoke, basically, the visa program has stipulations that you have to abide by when you enter into the United States. Same with the green card process. And one of those is not providing support or expressing support for terrorists. So there is a curtailing of free speech rights for visa holders in the United States, and that's always been recognized as a part of that visa green card program.
Yeah, but well, I don't think, though, without getting into the weeds of immigration law, we don't want to conflate completely visa holders and green card holders, because in fact green card holders, which Khalil is, have broader due process rights
than
visa holders do. So
yeah, he's absolutely allowed to appeal the process.
Do you think, we were just talking in a separate segment about conservative leaning media, and it does seem to me that people like Charlie Kirk and Ben Shapiro and Dinesh D'Souza was another person mentioned in a story from The Intercept, were people very much to the fore of arguing against, snowflakes and cancel culture and all of that. None of those guys seem to be raising any great concerns, and in fact in some cases seem to be cheering on the government in the current situation, no?
I think that's true, and I think it's because they draw a distinction between college students who are citizens of the United States exercising a right to free speech, whether it's by inviting a speaker or hosting an event on campus, versus having someone who actively supports a terrorist group taking advantage of the U.S. immigration system to come here with views that are inconsistent with American values.
But I don't think we should just assert without giving a person the chance to rebut it, that they, unless you're talking in very generalized terms. If you're talking about Mahmoud Khalil, I don't think we should just say, without giving him any chance to refute it, that he supports a terrorist group.
Well, he has had specific posts about October 7th describing them as freedom fighters and being openly pro-Hamas by carrying around posters that have the Hamas symbol on them. So I would say that's supportive of terrorism.
No, I mean, I think that supporting of terrorism involves material backing to a terrorist group.
Not in the visa and green card application that he filled out.
Okay, well, if that's the case, I will stand corrected then.
Thank you. And then on that point as well, he was one of the organizers of the very encampment that we were talking about. His group was responsible for that. He was actually the lead negotiator between the members of that encampment and the university. So I actually think the administration would have a much stronger case if they talked about that illegal action as opposed to some of this pro-Hamas speech that he's been engaged in, which is a little bit weaker in my opinion. One of the stronger cases is the university professor who attended the funeral of a member of Hezbollah. Like, I don't want that person in the United States. I think that the administration absolutely has authority over the immigration process to decide who is going to be an actual benefit to the U.S. and someone who supports a group like Hezbollah is not.
In relation to the broader point about the funding to Colombia and the actions that are purportedly geared toward anti-Semitism, one of the difficulties I have with this is, of course, the administration's actions, but it's also the extent to which Colombia appears to be about to kowtow to that demand. Because one of the bizarre things that I find about this, and it's based on reporting from the Wall Street Journal, is the Colombia apparently being willing to put a department of its own university into receivership of some fashion in order to keep federal funds flowing. That seems to me very worrisome, and very worrisome from the free speech perspective. If you have universities willing to bow to an administration of whatever type and basically put their own departments on some kind of notice, I mean, that just seems very dubious.
What department was it?
It was the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asia and Africa Studies.
Oh yeah, that's weird. I don't like that. And I would provide a similar example from the Biden administration, which was he predicated federal funding based on this revision of Title IX that ultimately got struck down by the courts of basically forcing public institutes of both K through 12 and higher learning of having to accept this idea that Title IX is protective of gender identity as opposed to just women. So it's pretty common, unfortunately, in every administration that they use the federal purse in order to affect policy by individuals or institutions that they otherwise would not have control over. And inevitably the question is, do you support the policy that they're trying to implement or not? And that's more of the stance that most people adhere to rather than a principled, the government should never use federal money as a means of enacting policy.
Right, exactly. And I think that is what makes a lot of these free speech debates actually more complicated in some ways, because people will often say, for example, I'm a free speech absolutist.
Yeah, I don't.
There are very few actual free speech absolutists, because it can get into such kind of murky territory. And I think inevitably people, including myself, get caught up in like, well, am I broadly sympathetic to what this person stands for or not?
Yeah, and I'm not a libertarian like Robbie.
No,
so.
I know. We'll have to get a new
We'll have
free
to get
speech
his,
absolutist.
I know, we'll have to get his perspective. But yeah,
sure.
I mean, I'm very obviously supportive of the idea of a culture of free speech, and certainly broadly supportive of the First Amendment and the government not overreaching. The distinction in this case for me is that Columbia allowed actions of students that actually curtailed other students' right to free speech.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that no right should be exercised that curtails someone else from exercising their own right in response. I also think, though, that when it gets into it, we were talking about this in relation to Teslas earlier on, for example, when it gets into actions of vandalism and so forth, the appropriate venue for that is the criminal courts.
Sure.
And, that's a separate debate. Anyway, should a bar or club be able to enforce a MAGA dress code? Let's get to that next.
It's nothing new for restaurants and bars to have a dress code, but what if they are trying to send out a political statement by mandating people look a certain way?
Something similar happened at a popular LGBTQ plus nightclub in Sacramento called Badlands, where they banned all MAGA-related attire.
Badlands shared the new policy on Instagram, writing in part, recently a guest entered the bar wearing MAGA attire, which led to discomfort among some patrons. In response, we initially decided to ban all political attire to avoid further issues. However, after careful consideration, we've realized that a blanket ban is not the right approach.
The post further said, moving forward, MAGA-related attire will not be allowed in the venue. This decision is not about banning political beliefs. It is about ensuring that Badlands remains a space where our community feels comfortable and supported.
The guest who wore the MAGA hat to Badlands told CBS 13, "This is the first time I've ever done this, worn a red Trump hat at the bar, so I was a little nervous." The policy received mixed reaction on social media. The Sacramento chapter of Log Cabin Republicans, a gay conservative group, wrote on Instagram, "The decision by Badlands to ban MAGA hats/apparel is a disappointing move that prioritizes division over the fundamental American principle of free speech. True equality is not about silencing opposing views, but about creating spaces where diverse perspectives can coexist."
Alice Mamberg, who lives in the same neighbourhood, told KCRA, "Given the current political climate and what's been going on and how the administration has been behaving towards certain groups, especially the LGBTQ community, I can understand why they made that decision." Can you understand why they made that decision, Amber? What do you make of it all?
I guess, they're allowed to do whatever they want.
Well, that's the thing, right.
Yeah, if you are a Trump supporter, then just don't go to that bar, I
Right.
guess.
So, this is the thing. This is one of those debates to me where there are two separate questions that often get conflated. Does a bar or other private establishment have the right to do that? And the answer is...
Should they?
And should they, right? Because they pretty clearly do have the right. They're a private institution, and political opinion is not a protected class in the way that race or gender are. Having said all that, and here I am on the free speech side of the question, I find it a bit just excessive to assume that the mere wearing of a MAGA hat is so distressing to people in any particular bar that kind of apparel has to be banned. I also think it is just underscoring that point by noting that guy who wore the hat is himself, however, what exact term he uses, he is a member of the LGBTQ community and he supports Trump. So it's not even somebody wearing a certain apparel in a way intended to goad gay people. He's wearing a hat reflecting his political beliefs in a gay establishment, being a member of that community himself.
Yeah, and this was a huge problem when Trump first became a popular political figure in 2015, where there were a lot of secret Trump supporters who felt like they couldn't talk about their support for him openly or wear apparel to that effect because they were worried about backlash from people in their community, their neighbors, their friends, their family, and even broadly just a random person walking down the street. We were talking about free speech on college campuses earlier. There were a lot of documented incidents of people who were wearing MAGA hats being assaulted on college campuses. And when Trump came back for his comeback in 2024, there seemed to be a cultural shift. People were more comfortable openly supporting the president. They were more comfortable wearing MAGA apparel. You had athletes doing the Trump dance prior to the election, and so it seemed like something of a vibe shift. And this bar feels like they're going back to that 2015, 2016 era. And I think generally speaking, beyond the fact that they have the right to do it, it is divisive. I mean, for them to only ban one side political apparel with the intention of protecting the so-called comfort of their other patrons feels discriminatory towards gay people who don't have the same political opinions. And there are a lot of gay men who support Trump. It's one of the most pro-Trump parts of the LGBTQ plus community. And I think it's unfortunate for them that they've basically been classified as traitors to their sexuality group or their community because they just have a different view on politics.
And to that point, I understand that the reason this was all happening in Sacramento was that it was the Log Cabin Republicans, which is a group of gay Republicans, were there for, I think, the California GOP state convention. That's why they were in Sacramento. Look, I am on the side of saying that people's sexuality or race or whatever should not determine their political leanings. Now, I think that there are certainly lots of arguments you could make in any political moment about which parties' policies benefit or are to the detriment of certain interests in certain communities, and that's obviously an important debate to have. But in this instance, I just think, to my mind, you're creating more of a problem than you're solving by banishing people wearing that hat. I'm sure it would occasion comment or criticism from people. I think that's fine. I think if some patron of that bar or club wants to go up and have an argument with that guy about wearing it, that's fine, unless it were to turn physical or intimidatory on either side. And I just think that there needs to be a bit more of an acknowledgement of people with very strongly held views. I'm trying to think of an analogy, and I'm struggling to think of one on the conservative side. Like, I guess if someone turned up at Mar-a-Lago with an anti-Trump t-shirt, would they be let in? Probably not, I suppose, right? But it's, I just think, we need to acknowledge people's differences a little more.
Yeah, and I think in this case, when you are banning the MAGA hats or MAGA apparel, you are creating a taboo and then reinforcing the sort of, for lack of a better term, authoritarian tendencies. These people don't have like political power, but you see what I'm getting at. Those tendencies of the group, and telling them that these fears where somebody else's speech makes them feel unsafe or uncomfortable is legitimate. And that's what creates that further divide, I think, is giving them weight to their idea that someone wearing a MAGA hat actually harms me in some way.
Right, and also that it is, I mean, obviously we have a very polarized country as it is, and so the suggestion presumably is not only people shouldn't wear a MAGA hat, it's that Trump supporters are unwelcome in the same space as other people who have much more liberal views. I don't really go for that. I don't believe really in a kind of voluntary separation of people where we all have to go and confine ourselves to only liberal or conservative spaces. I think that's unwise.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, and I talked to a lot of Trump supporters who would never tell people publicly that they voted for Trump, and who have lost a lot of friends and family members due to a misunderstanding about their reasons for supporting him. And I think that's very unhealthy for society, for there to be that feeling that you can't even have a conversation or a friendship with someone who thinks differently politically from you.
Yeah, I think that is unhealthy. I think sometimes there are reasons of sort of personal sensitivity that people don't want to get into very divisive debates, as a kind of form of social politeness sometimes. But if it's people feeling actually intimidated from expressing their views, then I don't think that's a good thing, obviously.
That's going to do it for us today on Rising. As always, be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen on the go, good news, we are now available anywhere you listen to podcasts.